Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. Thank you for joining us. A new book offers a closer look at the immigrant experience through personal stories that shine light on the impact of immigration policies in our country. Joining us for the program is Dr. Elaine Hampton, author of Seekers of a Stable Sky, Stories of Altruism and Immigration on the Mexican Border. Thank you so much for joining us, Elaine.
Thank you. It's my honor.
Now, I'd like to start off with a basic question about what was your inspiration for writing this book?
I just, through a series of many events over many years, happened to meet a few women, and they told me part of their story. It sounded very interesting. And so the more they told me, the more I realized how complicated their life was. And it was because they were south of the border, only because of that, the complexities that they had to deal with. And then what I found is that didn't stop them from doing amazing things. They started centers for children with disabilities. They welcomed highly disabled children into their homes. They started counseling centers and learned how to do the counseling. And they improved this whole community. Most of the ones I was talking about are located in the small community of Nafta, the northwest part of Ciudad Juarez. So I found it amazing. And I thought, well, if it interests me, maybe it will interest other people too.
It is interesting to learn about these stories, and I want to talk about those in just a moment. But first, I'd like to talk with you about your own history about growing up here in the borderland. You write in the book about that, crossing the border frequently, a much different looking border than we see today. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, a lot of you, the people who are listening, I think will remember how you could cross into Ciudad Juarez 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And all of the friends and neighbors from the rest of the United States would come visit you so we could go visit Ciudad Juarez. It was wonderful. There were great shops. There was amazing food. You could go to the markets and see things that you don't see in the United States. And there were the glass blowing factories where you would watch them melt down old Coke bottles and make these beautiful little intricate ships with threads of glass. And I always felt welcome. They seemed like they loved to have the white American folks come. Some people would try to practice their Spanish with you. Some would, they'd play music for you. Of course, always happy to give them a little bit of money for entertaining us. And of course, the paletas. Anybody who's had a Mexican paleta knows it's worth the trip.
Now, you went on to have a career at the University of Texas at El Paso, at UTEP. During this time, when was it that you discovered that you wanted to explore more about Ciudad Juarez and that community you talked about in Nafta, and learn more about the community and the people that live there?
Yeah. Before I went to UTEP in the late 90s, I worked as an environmental education outreach officer with an engineering program at New Mexico State University. And the environmental projects were tri-national or binational in 3 states. So we worked with El Paso, Ciudad Juarez, and Las Cruces on a lot of environmental projects. And I actually got to do a database or a survey of all the environmental education programs along both sides of the Mexican border, from Las Cruces all the way down to the mouth of the Rio Grande. And I've always had friends in Ciudad Juarez. And so when I was teaching at UTEP, I had a beautiful office on the 6th floor of the education building. And I could look out and see the hills of Ciudad Juarez. And through my travels through through Ciudad Juarez, I found that these huge, big factories were springing up, huge, hundreds of the factories, and hundreds of thousands of people were coming to the city. And I knew about, for example, near Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, the Intel factory came in, and they put in a high school. They provided a lot of support for the education in their community. So I thought, well, what are these factories doing? And there were US factories mostly, some Chinese, some Korean. What are they doing to give back to the community and to help education? So I got a grant and started studying that, and that got me deep into Ciudad Juarez and other parts of Mexico.
So share with us, what were some of those discoveries that you found out while exploring that and meeting people in the community and in the city?
Yeah. So in Puebla and Mexico City, where they also had big factories, we find the factory and follow the dirt road until I found the school and talked to the folks in the school, and they had friendships with the factories. And there would be a little bit of giving. You know, sometimes the employees would come and paint the school building, or one place made air conditioners, and they donated air conditioners. They couldn't be hooked up because of the infrastructure, but they still tried. Maybe they put in a cement field where kids could play basketball. And then I thought, well, of course, the majority were in Ciudad Juarez. And so I came to Ciudad Juarez and started doing the explorations, but it was hard. The factories are located all over, and there's no really maps that keep up with it. So I found a friend, a young woman who had worked in the factories, and her name was Anai. And so I hired her to be my guide. And that led to opening many doors into understanding and having more friends and experiences in Mexico in that kind of environment.
Now, on this program in the past, we've interviewed you about Anai and your relationship and her life story that she wrote about as she pursued an education and a better life for herself and her family. I'd like to hear from you a little bit more, though, as you were doing this and building these relationships. What was it that you discovered about privilege and your own privilege and cultural distortion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, anytime I cross the border, I'm tall and old and very white, and I stand out. And there's the assumption, and rightly so from their point of view, that most any white person that crosses the border brings lots of economic resources. Compared to what they have, that's true. And so I know that I am viewed from that point of view. But worse is the way I viewed them, just not understanding. Before I knew, well, early in our relationship with Anai, I told her, well, come cross the bridge and we'll go visit such and such a place. And I didn't realize for her that meant bundling the baby up in the winter and walking across, an hour walk for her, standing in the line. And then to get back, she had to do it all over again. She was not feeling well either. But in order not to disappoint me, she went through that. And then I saw the ways that just everything that I do easily would take layers and layers and layers. I get a drink of water, I go turn on the tap, it's clean, and I drink it. For the people that I met there, and still, to get a drink of clean water, you have to, in Nafta, you go on your day, your appointed day of the week. There's 2 days you can go, and you go to the water collection facility and you get your clean water, and you have to drag it home. It's heavy. So you have to have a cart or a car and take it home. You do have tap water, but it's extremely salty and you can't drink it, and it's not healthy. So that's just an example, but everything, doing the laundry, changing the diapers, buying clothes, baby diapers, all of those things are extremely complex. And so I have to be very respectful of that if I ask a favor of any Mexican. So I made many mistakes. They're funny to talk about, but they weren't so funny for the people at that time.
Now, today, I mean, a lot of folks discover this after a lot of experience going through these things like this that you experienced, getting to know community members. But I'd like to hear a little bit more about immigration policy. You brought it up a little bit as we began the conversation. Of course, when you were a child crossing the border frequently, I mentioned it was a much different looking border. Now, the steps that people have to go through to be able to cross back and forth have become more complicated. When did you discover just how complicated things were at the U.S.-Mexico border for folks who wanted to cross on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, as this has emerged, over the last 10 years, 10 to 20 years, things have become extremely different. And I even call it a social chasm, crossing the borders. It's almost a chasm that you go over. And people in my culture don't particularly care to see what that's like and to understand that. And every one of the women that I interviewed has had some kind of crossing the border experience, legal or illegally. One who was seeking asylum is actually safe in the United States now. The others have chosen to stay in Anapra or in Mexico. That's their home, but they still had to get across. And someone called it the United States is the giant frosted cupcake flaunting itself to its neighbors. And that's kind of what it's like. But my culture, I am still ignorant as much as I studied it, because it's not attractive to study immigration policy and immigration law. It's not fun. It's complex. There are many, many organizations doing many different things. And who the immigrants are is something that a lot of people don't want to think about. You don't want to think about them personally and know who they are personally, because if it's just a big general sweep, we can say those people are criminals and rapists and we shouldn't let them over the border. It's much easier to deal with it that way because you can go about your life without having to think about it. But when you understand that the people are your brothers and sisters, often with higher moral standards than I could ever imagine, higher levels of persistence and resistance. I think it's important that we know that.
Now, what are the things that are getting in the way of us knowing that? Is it rhetoric surrounding immigration policy? Is it the media? Is it national politicians that are repeating the rhetoric? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, everything you've said there, and the complexity of it. Immigration law itself is volumes and volumes of very thick books, and that's the broken law that we work with. Trying to get new laws are almost impossible because of the divisions in the way we think. I went to the Ellis Island Museum one time, and I thought, oh, Ellis Island, the place where we've always welcomed immigrants. But then you see a collection of political cartoons throughout history, and it's always been almost a divide. No, immigrants are all bad, keep them away. And we've created academic structures trying to prove that, versus those who say, no, immigration is good for our community. We need the people to stimulate us and to make our communities better. So it was a complete divide throughout all of human history. So here we are stuck, I think, in one of the worst divides, though, about this. And what individual who doesn't know and love the border like we do, who doesn't understand the people, doesn't know them, what individual is going to take the time to really delve deeply into what this really is, who is immigrating and why? And certainly not every immigrant experiences should we welcome. I don't even know. It's just all the complexities, 1,000 reasons why people try to come across the border, and 1,000 things that happen when they get into the border, onto our side.
Yeah, I mean, stories are important, especially with folks who are personally involved in the challenges that we're trying to face here in our country. Sharing those stories like you've shared with the women that you've met and have grown to know over decades. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Can you share with us a little bit about the women you write about and the extraordinary challenges that they've overcome?
Yeah. When I was at UTEP, I would take my students down to a little school that was really just a shack. and my students would practice teaching science lessons there, and it was just a wonderful experience. The school welcomed us. I made mistakes in the school, but they were always forgiving. They would let me come back and try again. I got to teach the sixth graders in an abandoned bus for a little while. We helped them get a library, and the city helped. And through the years, we watched that school develop. But then the violence happened in the late 2017 area, times like that. And the principal said, please don't come back anymore. It's dangerous for you and it's dangerous for me. So we didn't go back for years. And then one day I was walking on the farmers market mall in Las Cruces, and I saw these beautiful prayer flags. And prayer flags are the things that the Buddhists put around their temples, just cloths, colorful cloths, strung on a string with wonderful sayings. And it turned out that those prayer flags were made by a group of people in Anapra, some women in Anapra, right where the school was that I had visited. And so I asked the woman in charge, who's binational herself, lives on both sides of the border, said, could I go? And she said, sure, I think the women would love for you to hear their stories. So that started that part of the research. And it turned out they're called guerrilla prayer flags, not like the big 8 gorilla, but Guerilla, because this group of women had tried many things to improve their community. They tried, for example, starting in Nafta, there's one big supermarket on the main street, and then all of the other streets go way up into the sandhills. And so it would take you 30 minutes to an hour sometimes to walk to the supermarket, and then you'd have to take your materials, your bags of groceries back up the hills. So they thought, well, what if we can get a van, and then we'll just take, for 50 cents, we'll pay to get them back and forth. So they did that, and it was very successful. But the bus drivers in that community, whose bus routes go right by that, felt threatened. And so they violently threatened the women. The women had to stop that. And they tried other things, but they met with frustration and problems. And so finally they said, well, what if we work in the back of one of the women's community centers houses where there's a little workshop. They said, let's work back in the workshops and make these pretty prayer flags, and we'll sell the prayer flags. And you can buy them on Etsy. They're wonderful. And you're supporting the women when you do that. So I got to go visit, and in the workshop, I interviewed several of the women who were part of that. So the women all have children with disabilities for many reasons. It's an environmental hazardous place. It's for air quality and water quality are not ideal there. And then people work in the maquiladoras, and there are dangers that surround that. And so many of the women have children with disabilities. And so the benefit they get from the prayer flag, they go around to other women and say, here, we can help you. Come to the center and we'll do therapy with your children, or we'll build you a sidewalk, or get you a wheelchair. And it was a wonderful group of folks, and they're still around, still doing their great things.
Now, you also write about just healthcare challenges that many of the women experienced. How has that changed? And can you kind of share with us about some of those challenges that the women in that community face when it comes to healthcare?
Right. It's always a complex issue. One of the women is Dr. Juana Mendoza. 25 years, this woman has given up everything. She's a doctor and has kept a little clinic going there, helping mostly young women. Those are the ones who come with the most severe problems. Because of the extreme poverty, the remoteness, the lack of education, the lack of quality experiences, the herding people in buses to work in the factories, all of those things make life stressful and dangerous. And young women in particular are vulnerable. So many young women, little girls basically, are raped, don't understand what's happening. They show up at the clinic and they say, I don't know what happens, it really hurts, and they're having a baby. And so Dr. Mendoza for 25 years has tried to get this message out, to get education improved. She used her own money. There's a Lutheran church in El Paso that helps support them. She gets donations, and she's used this money to educate the girls, to try and start programs to help them to get them to the hospital for the proper health care that they need. So she's just one of the heroes. But having the right doctor to deliver the baby whenever you have complications with your baby, sometimes that's just not possible in a little remote area like this. So all kinds of issues there. But the women work through as much as they can.
There's also community organizations and organizations in our region that are working to assist folks in that community. Can you tell us a little bit about those organizations?
Yeah, there's some are religious. We've had a group of nuns from, actually started in Cincinnati, but they now live in La Union. And they found Inez, the woman who's kind of the leader of the prayer flag group. They found her and the other women and these children with problems. They'd had a normal clinic, and they said, wait a minute, what we really need is a clinic that supports families with children with disabilities. So they found quite a bit of funding, and they have a lovely clinic that has massage therapy, Tai Chi therapy, education for the children. The whole family can come. Tutoring services for the young children, or children who are in school and not doing well. And another group of ex-nuns, they had to leave their convent because the convent assigned them to work with people who they thought had too many privileges in Mexico. And they loved Nafta, and they wanted to work in that community where they knew extreme stress was evident everywhere they went. And so the evolution of all of these organizations is wonderful, because the people who were giving came in with open minds, and they just sat with the community and learned from the community, and let the community leaders and community women guide them into what was really needed. And so the second one ended up being a group called the Ants in Community, or Las Hormigas en Comunidad. It's an amazing counseling center right there in Nafta, in the corner of Ciudad Juarez, where they have a Montessori school, one of the best schools in the whole city for the families, the children of the families that they're working with. They have group counseling, they have therapy sessions, and they have elevated. There's evidence they didn't have an evaluation, several evaluations that show they've elevated the self-confidence of the women in the communities, so that they're able to stand up and resist a lot of the abuses that they've encountered.
Now, obviously, we're talking at a time when the pandemic has impacted so much in our country, in our community, and our region. But what about this community? What do you know so far, how the community has responded to the pandemic, and how are they facing that challenge?
They haven't had the luxury of stopping. It's a crowded community. You can't always get what you need. You have to go about most of your daily business. The maquiladoras, I don't know all of the story. I've heard good stories that the maquiladoras said, no, we'll pay you to work half-time so we can cut the work, so we can cut the population down. And then some maquiladoras have not done that. They've been somewhat unethical. So I guess it just depends on the big factory and what they were doing. But then the daily life of the people, would you have 20 people in your family that come eat with you every day, that continues. So many of them have gotten the disease and gotten over it. And the last time I visited, just a few weeks ago, everybody was doing fine. There was no fear of it. But then the new, I don't know what's happening now. I have to go check with the new strand coming out.
Now, we just have a couple minutes left, but I'd like to talk with you a little bit more about Nafta and its effect on this community and the lives of the women that you've met and grown to know. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Nafta is that North American Free Trade Agreement. 70s and 80s, I think, it was started. And as with anything, there are good things and bad things. From the United States point of view, with looking through our distorted lens, well, this will be great. We will give give people jobs, lots and lots of jobs. And they did, 350 jobs in Ciudad Juarez alone. And they get some social security benefits. A few of them get some housing. Sometimes they'll give you free lunch. Sometimes they'll help you get your education. But with 350 factories there, it varies tremendously from highly unethical practices to some very strong factories that I visited that really did find good workers, pay for them to go off and get technical education and come back and work in the factory. And so it did give some wonderfully good jobs. But overall, it's the worker's income is a crime. Even if the people have a really good experience, to be paid $5 to $10 a day is criminal. The only way you can make it survive is if your whole household works in the factory, and some of you stay home and stay with the kids while others work the night shift, and then you swap off, and then you can make it work. But it puts them in very vulnerable positions also.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's powerful stories that you shared with us. Can you share with us where folks can find your book?
Yeah, it's on Amazon.com. Seekers of a Stable Sky. It's at Literarity in El Paso and most of the bookstores in Las Cruces. So it's easy to find. It's an inexpensive book. I worked hard to make sure it was inexpensive. And we're working on a Spanish translation, so hopefully we get that out soon.
Wonderful. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Elaine Hampton, for joining us for the program and sharing more about your book.
Always a pleasure, Anthony. Thank you for all you do.
And we want to thank you for joining us for another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.